Hello and welcome to the Ricardian Podcast, which is brought to you by the Richard III Society. My name is Alec Marsh, and in the first episode of this new series, we're going to get a bit book clubby, because we're going to be discussing the greatest Ricardian books of all time. And not just that, we're going to sift through the hundreds of titles devoted to the life and times of Richard III with the aim of trying to identify the single greatest book written about him. So it's not an easy task. Fortunately, we have three experts to help us achieve this objective. First, I'm delighted to welcome a new guest to the podcast, Kenneth Hillier. Ken is a retired history teacher and bibliophile who's been a Ricardian since 1973, when he went to the National Portrait Gallery's now famous Richard III exhibition. Welcome, Ken.
Thank you.
Next, we have a regular of the podcast back with us, Joanna Laynesmith, historian and author of books including a scholarly biography of Richard III's mother, Cecily Neville, and editor of the Richard III Society's academic journal. Welcome, Joanna.
Hello.
Finally, we have another returning guest, David Grummitt, historian and author of books on the Wars of the Roses and martial culture in England in the 15th century, and of course, the Richard III Society's research officer. Welcome to you, David.
Hello.
So let us turn to the topic in hand, starting with you, David Grummitt. Please, could you give us your chosen picks for the greatest Ricardian books of all time? So these are titles that have either shifted the dial on what people think about Richard III, or in some way been the most influential, important. I'll allow you to pick a maximum of two or three at this stage, and if you could keep your answers to less than 2 minutes or so, that would be lovely. Over to you.
Okay, thank you, Alec. Well, my first book is by Vivian Beatrix Lamb, The Betrayal of Richard III, and it was first published in 1959. And it's only a little pamphlet, really. I think it was the only book she wrote, but it was something which I think a lot of Ricardians have probably know very well, and it was republished by the Society in 2015 with an introduction by Peter Hammond. But throughout it deals with the Ricardian legend, if you like, the actual thing, this traditional view that the Society has long held, is untenable, and it's a really great primer. Even 60 plus years after its first publication, it remains a really good primer on a Ricardian view of history, but also of how Richard's reputation was subsequently blackened. So that's my first Ricardian text. My second is a much more recent one, and it's a book which really, for me, exemplifies the work of the Society. It's Livia Visser-Fuchs and Anne Sutton's The Books of Richard III. Now, many people will know this, and of course, it originated in a long series of articles that Anne and Olivia did in the Ricardian over several years, and they were published, collected together and put in a book. And we don't really know very much about Richard III's books, in effect. We only have, I think it's about 16 titles that we know that he owned. But what the book does really wonderfully, I think, is it recreates the mental world and the kind of cultural world of Richard. And it's one of those things for me which really kind of captures what the Society does, which is not only talk about Richard and talk about the kind of the things we're always talking about, but actually put them into context. And it's a really good example of the kind of really careful research which has underpinned so much of what the Society's done in the last 50, 60 years.
Okay, Dave. Now, in danger of making you last longer than 2 to 3 minutes, the books of Richard III, which you say there's 16 titles, in a nutshell, what do they say about the man that we're talking about?
Well, this is part of the kind of the problem, in that they don't directly say very much at all. And in fact, some of the reviews of the book when it first came out said, well, this is a really lost opportunity because it doesn't tell us very much about Richard himself. But of course, what it does is tell us about the world that Richard inhabited. And I think that's its main strength. So it explores personal piety, it explores chivalry, and it also, of course, reminds us that Richard was a European prince and that England was very much connected to those neighbouring polities, particularly in the Burgundian Low Countries and France.
Okay, so we've got one book which is, as you say, the 1959 primer on the Ricardian debate. on the man himself and all that's followed, and that's V.B. Lamb's The Portrayal of Richard III. And then we've got a book which is much more of a kind of presentation of key sources, the books, the library that we know of Richard III. Okay, well, they're both compelling titles. So let's turn to you, Joanna Laynesmith. Joanna, what are your nominations for this very hard question of trying to discern the kind of most pivotal Ricardian books?
Well, I'd want to start with Sir Clements Markham's Richard III and his life and character, reviewed in the light of recent research, which was first published in 1906, because I think this is the book which kicked off modern Ricardianism. This is the book which Saxon Barton, founder of the Society, gave to Patrick Bacon, its first member. And I think this is the book, well, it is, I know this is the book that really inspired those first Ricardians, because Philip Lindsay, his book that followed, was very much based on this book. So Clements Markham was actually in his 70s by the time he was writing this. He'd had this amazing career in the Navy and in the India Office, and it's a real boy's own adventure stuff. Helped launch the polar expeditions and was really important for Captain Scott and all this. So he's got this wonderful, exciting story behind him, which I think infuses the book that he writes, which is heroic, and it's your real romantic 19th century view of the Wars of the Roses. Some of it is actually a bit uncomfortable to read now, if I'm honest. Dying gloriously in battle when you're 17, Edward of Lancaster. No, actually, that was just horrible and tragic. And so for a modern reader, there's definitely some problematic bits. But in terms of how important it was for the Society, I think it's got to be there. It starts with this a narrative, completely straightforward, really exciting to read. And then the second half is when he deals with all the controversies. And what he was particularly doing was addressing James Gairdner's highly respected biography that had come before. He'd already kind of had a run-in with James Gairdner in the English Historical Review. He'd actually also already written a couple of articles on the Battle of Wakefield, on the Battle of Towton. And you can really see that in the book as well, because they really take up a lot of the narrative. But yeah, so he set the case. So I think that's really important. That's what inspired the Fellowship of the White Boar.
And to the broader context, it also, as you say, kick-started modern Ricardianism. And would you go as far to argue that there's a line between him and Paul Murray Kendall and other people?
Josephine Tay, absolutely. She very much modelled her story, which has been so influential on the interpretation that Markham gives, because his is the story that actually the princes lived right through Richard's reign and were in fact killed by Henry VII. And so Josephine Tay picks this up and really runs with his interpretation, his attitude to Thomas More and Cardinal Morton and so forth. Paul Murray Kendall, on the other hand, he had this great phrase. I wonder if I can find it. Oh, yes. Markham's Richard is a sterling symbol of English pluck, mantled in the airs which blow upon the playing fields of Eton and the glorious reaches of the 19th century British Empire. Obviously, as an American, he perhaps found all these references to the high courage of his race and so forth particularly stuck in the throat. But anyway, you wouldn't say it influenced Kendall all that much.
And have you got a second book?
So my second book would be Jeremy Potter's Good King Richard, with a question mark, an account of Richard III and his reputation. It was written in 1983 by the then chair of the Richard III Society. And of course, Jeremy Potter was such an influential chair. Anyway, he gave us the trial of Richard III, set up the Yorkist History Trust, the statue at Leicester, all that kind of thing. But this was another really important thing that I think he contributed to the Society, a bit of a kind of a manifesto for the Society for the 1980s, really, because he runs through the debate, how we got where we are in terms of Richard's reputation. It's all really measured and balanced. And he quotes Kendall in terms of, yes, maybe Richard killed the princes, maybe Buckingham killed the princes. The point is, it's completely unacceptable to say he definitely did it, we just don't know. And other parts like that. So it's a really measured, sensible book, which I think has still got a lot of value today.
And how influential would you say the book was in 1983? Apart from being a good read, did it cut through?
Yeah, I wasn't very old in 1983, so I'm not sure I could say, if I'm really honest. I think, yes, I don't think it was as influential in terms of its narrative of Richard, because he was just picking up what everyone else was doing. It was a good synthesis.
Okay, yeah, okay, all right. Well, that is brilliant. I think they're two quite hard books to beat. I'm just putting it out there. I'm not trying to skew the panel here at all. Let's turn to you, Kenneth Hillier. Ken, I'm going to gamble that as a kind of the resident bookworm of the society, you've read more of these books than most people have. What are your 2 or 3 selections for Greatest Ricardian book?
As an aside, I thought lovely comment from another historian about Markham was he was an uninhibited geographer. I thought I've rather summed him up. But like the other 2, I'm sure you find it very difficult to narrow it down to 2, let alone 6 or whatever. And with me, Ross and Kendall just missed out. But I went on to, I think above all, Rosemary Horrocks' book. It came out of a PhD. With all the strengths and weaknesses of PhDs, they can sometimes become rather monotonous. But I think she was helped by her own style, actually, a very clear, cold, analytical style. But what Horrocks did was that she put right at the centre, right at the front of everything, the reasons for Richard's success as a duke and his essentially failure as a king. And this was the role of the king's servants, whether they were a household at the top, but the king's servants is the central theme, really, of the whole of Horrocks' PhD. They're vital, and she puts it into 3 main areas: for the administration of his estates, the maintenance of order, not just for Richard, but for monarchy in general, and sometimes the raising of troops. And she, for me, makes a very effective case for the mutuality of service versus patronage. Good lordship, I think, is the phrase that she uses regularly, that the monarch gives reward, usually for past service, not for future service, and the servant, as long as he or she, usually it's he, is confident of future benefits, then they will give service to the monarch. And I think Richard himself, as a duke, is the best example, almost, with Hastings, of the service. That he's the linchpin, really, of Edward IV and the Yorkist royal authority, particularly, of course, in the north, but with Hastings and 1 or 2 others. It's the social cement, the political, the economic cement that not just the Yorkists, but monarchy needed, particularly in the late 15th century. And that, I think, is the key to his success as the younger brother of the Duke of the North.
And Ken, before you turn to your second book, when was Rosemary Horrocks' Study and Service published?
It was published in 1989. I assume a PhD.
And is it your sense that the way she looked at the reign has become a kind of, if not defining, highly influential way that historians since her have looked at the reign and looked at the relationship in the way people work together? Is that?
I think, yes, I think she's very important, not just for the general reader like myself, but for other historians. If you look at the bibliographies of other historians, Horrocks is nearly always there, particularly in the general histories, but also in the more specific ones. But I think what she does is she explains very much why Richard failed. There's bad luck, obviously, as well as bad judgment. But the 1483 Buckingham Rebellion comes across absolutely as the turning point. Horrocks, I think, pinpoints it and explains why. We all know about the plantations of not necessarily northerners, but of Richard's retinue in southern positions. And ever since the rebellion, he may have, as she says, he may have dealt with the revolt, but he hasn't jumped on the rebellion. Rebellion is still there for another 2 years. And not just abroad either, they're within the country. And it's interesting that after Bosworth, and I'm quoting her, only 6 of the 28 pardoned rebels had received a royal grant by the time of Bosworth. So they're still there. He's brought 1 or 2 into the fold. But I think what Horrocks explains to me is that he never regains the initiative. Time essentially runs out. He depends too much on his plantation, his own retinue. It's a dangerously limited power base. And it can get a bit detailed, well, it's a monograph after all, but it really is something which I came away from it understanding Richard's long period under his brother with his short reign, and understood why, but also who.
Okay, so that I've given you way more than 2 minutes for one of your books, but that was really good.
Yes.
Can you tell us about your second book that you're bringing to the table?
Yes, might not be too popular with Ricardians, but I found David Horspool's book, and I think what he does is he eschews equally the Black Legend and the maligned monarch. And what he does is he says in his introduction that he is aiming for neutrality. I think it's more than that. I think it is a pretty objective look at Richard. One has too much of the histrionics. I'm quoting again. I think I'm with Lord Hastings on this, that I prefer historians with no axe to grind. And so what we've got is, I think, with Horspool, he's come in as an outsider. And if you read through it, he's got a lovely style, flashes of humour, but he comes through, and same with Horrocks, I understood his argument. And he used his sources well. He reiterates, yes, the contemporary view that a strong king made for a strong country, and the precondition for overmighty subjects is an undermighty ruler. Now, you don't put Richard in the same class as, say, Henry VI or even Richard II, but in some ways, Richard was an undermighty ruler because he never really controlled his country. And Horspool brings this out. And Horspool's figure is a tragic one. Richard is a tragic figure. And if you look at it, in 1483, he could have been, almost would have been, the ideal figure to steer a young monarch through his early years. He was powerful, he was experienced, he was certainly trustworthy over the last 15 years or so. Horspool reckons he could have become William Marshall. But what went wrong, if we go back to Horrocks, we will see what went wrong was the individual relationship. Monarchy wasn't just a concept. Monarchy depended on personal relations, personal trust. And unfortunately, for too many important people, Richard either never had in the first place or lost that trust. And finally, of course, Horrocks, they all make the same point. You have an alternative. If there'd been no alternative in 1483 to 5, then it would have been a damp squib, and we could have talked about Richard III, Richard IV, Richard V, but there was an alternative.
Okay, brilliant. Well, look, now that gives us 6 quite strong titles. Before we discuss them anymore, I'm afraid we have to start whittling. So we've got to start narrowing it down. So in the interest of fairness, I'm going to ask each of you to whittle away one of the books that you have brought to the table. You can only take one of these books to the desert island. So I'll ask you to do that now, make your mental decision, and then I'll turn to you first, Joanna. Could you tell us which book you're keeping and why? And I'm sure it's a very agonising decision.
I'm going to keep Clements Markham because in terms of actual influence, I think that was the more influential.
Brilliant. David, I'm going to turn to you next. Who are you keeping and why?
I'm keeping Vivian Lamb, and that is not only but partly because of its brevity. And in an age of busyness and shortened attention spans and all the rest, I think a little book like this, 127 pages, which sums up the Ricardian debate very expertly, I think is something that everybody should have in their back pocket. It's a small volume in size, but a large volume in its impact.
A small volume in size, but a large volume in impact. Now, come on, Ken. What are you keeping and why? And can you do as well as that?
After what David has just said, I don't think Horrocks would make the cut. But I think Horrocks has had a tremendous influence on other historians, people like Horspool and others who have written subsequently since the 1980s, 1990s, and you can see her influence in the sections in their books, their more general books, and so I put on Horrocks.
Okay, brilliant. Okay, so I mean that gives us 3 quite different books. We go, from 1906, written by a man who has a mountain in Antarctica named after him by Robert Falcon Scott, to 1959. I think V.B. Lamb might have been secretary of the society, which Third Society at some point. She's a kind of enthusiast, like Markham, an enthusiast. And then we've got Rosemary Horrocks, who is obviously one of the most significant current historians in the field. We need to whittle down further, but before we do, can I ask our two kind of historians here about Rosemary Horrocks and the book that Ken has advocated, so the Study in Service from 1989. David, if I turn to you first, can you give me a quick appraisal of your assessment of this book's importance?
Yeah. So when I was, when I was doing my PhD in the mid '90s, this was reasonably. Was reasonably fresh, and that idea of lordship and patronage being a sort of a reciprocal thing. Lords were expected to offer lordship and protect their servants, and servants were supposed to serve them loyally. It's hugely influential, and I sort of looked at the way in my PhD of how Henry VII and particularly went around, building an affinity out of the sort of embers of Yorkist and Ricardian rule, and how many, Ricardians and Yorkists came to serve Henry VII. Sir James Tyrrell being, probably, or Sir Thomas Montgomery being two of the best examples. So for that, Ken's absolutely right. I mean, it was a groundbreaking study, and it also, I think, it was important because it shifted the emphasis back onto kingship and away from the kind of Macfarlane county study that had dominated 15th century studies, with Christine Carpenter's book on Warwickshire, Simon Palin on Derbyshire, was Ian Aitchison on Leicestershire. They're all county-based studies, and here was looking at a great lord who became king and how that affinity worked.
Brilliant, thank you. Now, Joanna, same question really. What's your assessment of Rosemary Horrocks' 1989 Study in Service?
Oh, well, I love it. It's great to have a book which kind of gets you close to Richard and his world, that isn't shaped by that sort of the political narrative. So many of our books on the Wars of the Roses, and Richard particularly, are focused and held together by that narrative, whereas Rosemary's just gives you such a richer picture, the reality of the everyday. It gives us in a way, a more realistic picture of what life felt like, because instead of just picking up the striking bits, which tend to dominate our picture of it, all about the relationship, and it's just so useful. I'm always going back to it to work out where people fit in and how his relationship with them was.
That sounds like quite a strong contender. Brilliant, thank you for that, Joanna. Now, before we vote, Ken, can I ask you to give your assessment briefly of our three runners and riders?
Well, I needn't go over Horrocks again, although I thoroughly approve of what's just been said, of course. But Markham I found splendid. It is a rip-roaring boys' own paper effort, and none the worse. Polemical is too strong a word. What it is it gives a good kick into the 20th century, as Joanna said. And it had so much influence on the 1930s, 40s, 50s. It was tremendously influential. And I reread it a little bit a couple of nights ago, knowing Joanne had picked it. And it's good fun. And he has wonderful stuff. I love the way he goes on about, he's in the same series, isn't he, as Buck, Walpole, Lindsay himself, Kendall, and so on. But he goes on about the awful caricature that Gairdner, his great rival, very different people, aren't they? Gairdner and the Victorian gluttony for work that he talks about. Potter calls him the new Walpole, doesn't he? Jeremy Potter says he's the new Walpole. But he says that the caricature, one of his favourite words, caricature of the last Plantagenet king was too grotesque and too greatly opposed to his character, and interestingly derived from the official records. He did work. He wasn't just sitting down and writing a novel. He actually went back to the records, and the same records he, as you all know, had quite a long discussion. It reminds me a little bit of G.G. Coultham, who always arguing with somebody else in the various journals. And to be fair, this is what Markham does. Over the 1890s, he has this argument in the journals with Gairdner and others, and his book is the result not just of I'll dash off another one. I've finished doing a polar exploration. I'll now look at Richard III. He has spent well over a decade chewing over, thinking about a monarch who he thinks was grossly maligned, and he's had a tremendous influence, and it's worth a read in 2026, which I think makes a book valuable.
So, okay, so you're being sound like you're advocating for the wrong book here now, Ken. And what about V.B. Lamb? How do you think that stands up?
I think I've got my copy.
Yeah.
I read it all again last night so that I knew what David was talking about. And actually, it is if I was going to recommend a starter, Lamb would be in the starter lot to be given over. It's short. Peter Hammond's extra is probably worth, getting the more modern one, reading Peter's comments as well. But Lamb is, I think, in a different way from Markham. Lamb came out in 959, first of all. We're talking about another half century after Markham. And I think Lamb, we don't know how much effect these books had, although I think there's an argument for Markham. But Lamb, I read it, I bought it in 1965 or whatever, and it gave me a nice short run about the legend. I think she's very useful on the legend, whereas you look at G.B. Churchill and others for more information. But Lamb is a jolly good starter.
Okay, so we've got
finishing post, another matter.
So we've got three strong contenders. Okay, so we're going to have to lose one of them. Okay, so I'm going to put the vote to the three of you since you're our experts, and I'm going to ask you to cast 2 votes each. You have to vote at least twice, and you can't vote for your book twice. And I think this means that we shouldn't have a dead heat. So I'm going to give you 10 seconds to write down your answers on a piece of paper. And when you're ready, give me the nod. Look at that.
Got my spelling right.
Okay, so 3 nods. Okay, so obviously listeners can't see this, but everyone has flawlessly obeyed the question. So now, Joanna, will you go first and tell us who you voted for?
Horrocks and Markham.
So Horrocks and Markham. Okay, next, David. This is crushingly exciting. Who have you voted for?
Lamb and Horrocks.
Lamb and Horrocks. Okay, I think I can see how this is going to go. Right, now you two, Ken, who have you voted for?
Surprisingly, Horrocks.
Yep.
Horrocks, can you see it?
Horrocks. Yeah. And the other one, Markham. Okay, fine. So that means we're going to eliminate V.B. Lamb. I'm sorry.
Can I just come in, Alec, and just have a little bit of an argument for Lamb, and it's actually it's not so much an argument for Lamb, but an argument against Markham, because actually a lot of what Markham says, particularly on the bit that I know particularly well, which is of course about Wakefield and Towton. Markham is terribly at sea. He's absolutely hopeless. He gets the gate of Wakefield of Sandal Castle, facing in the wrong direction, which must be a cardinal sin for a geographer.
I knew you'd hate all that. I knew you would.
Yeah.
As I read it, I thought David's going to hate all this.
But he's, and then it just makes me wonder how much of this was actually driven by his animus towards James Gairdner, who was, for all his fault,
that's a typical historian.
Wonderful historian and archivist. I mean, so much of what we know about the reign of Richard is because of those letters and papers of Richard III and Henry VII that Gairdner edited. So I'm just going to have to say, that
you're a bad loser, David.
That I'm no fan of Markham. There we go.
Okay,
it's a triumph of style over substance, Alec.
I think you're making the point that in some ways V.B. Lamb stands the test of time better because things she said haven't been superseded. But I suppose what we're trying to work out here is if one book that kind of in summation brings it all to the table, and just by dint of having much more of the story in it, perhaps Markham can claim to have that legitimacy, not to mention the fact that it's earlier, so it's got another 50 years of influence of waving the Ricardian flag.
And I think actually that was a really I was say there's a really important point Joanna made at the beginning, which I hadn't really took on board, but how influential it was in the early history of the society.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I was just going to add, having ploughed through 19th century novels but started with Walter Scott. Walter Scott was accused of bad history, and quite rightly so in many cases. But he said if it stimulates you to read further into the topic, whether it be Louis XI or whoever, if there's an initial stimulation, which is, I suppose, the best argument for good fiction, not bad fiction, then I looked again at Jeremy Potter, and Jeremy Potter said history is not made by great men and women, nor by social and economic forces. It is made by historians. And, know the historian. I used to teach at A level, know the historian before you look at his history, which can be a bit cynical, obviously, but history's changing all the time. It's continually being reassessed. David, you mentioned Wakefield. There's a perfect example of something which has been reassessed, and we're coming up with quite a different opinion, backed up by some very valid points, which were there all the time, but David and others have looked at all these again. Barnet has changed, hasn't it? So has, of course, Richard himself and Bosworth. You wonder what's going to change next. But so this is where Markham, I think, I agree with what you said, David, but Markham is a stimulant, an ever so important one. This is why I think Kendall was also a good one. Even Rouse, even that ghastly one by Desmond Stewart, who I think is one of the worst books ever written about Richard III, and another chap called Terry Breverton, who I had to review. Nonsense, but it stimulates. Even if you argue against almost everything that the person says, it has done something. It's made you think again, which is, I think, vital. If you put down a book saying, I knew all that, then it hasn't helped, has it, at all? But if it's a book which stimulates, particularly against what you may believe, it's very good. That's why Markham's good. That's where Lamb and Horsfall are perhaps better histories, but they haven't got that oomph.
On oomph, then. On oomph. So we're left with two, at the end of this grueling, comprehensive, highly scientific and granular process, we're left with two titles. So this is a Rosemary Horrocks Study and Service from 1989 and Sir Clements Markham's Richard III, which has a much longer title and was published in 1906. Now, there is a consolation prize, David, for being the advocate of the book that didn't make the final cut, and that is that I'm going to ask you to adjudicate, because it is simply a question that goes beyond my abilities, and but on behalf of the listeners and everyone waiting in bated breath to find out which is the greatest Ricardian book of all time, please can you make a decision and let us know your reasoning for it.
Gosh, well, thank you, Alec. That's a poison chalice, isn't it? I think I am swayed by the arguments of both Ken and Joanna here, and I think it has to be Markham. I mean, without that trailblazing defence of Richard, we may not be here today. Without somebody as passionate and as eloquent as Markham, that traditional interpretation wouldn't have been challenged, and James Gairdner's legacy would be alive and well today, and he would be as authoritative historian on Richard III as he is on Henry VII and Henry VIII. So Clement Markham.
Okay.
Actually, I would have gone.
You're in shock. Well, congratulations, you're the winner, Joanna, and also Clements Markham, of course. So, Cole, how do you respond to this news that you are the winner and Clements is the winner?
Well, yeah, I'm in shock because I was sure it would be Rosemary Horrocks, actually. But I think what I would mention about Markham is that, of course, he relied really heavily on George Buck. And so he's part of this big story. And I felt he ought to get a mention in at some point as well. And I think it's good to know that it's only 99p on Kindle to get a copy and read
it. Brilliant. Okay, one final question that none of you are ready for, because I've not told you I'll ask you this, but we have scrupulously avoided fiction here. And fiction has had a powerful hand to play in inspiring people to be interested in Richard III, the real story or the imagined story, or a different story from the one that they were told at school. Can I ask each of you to nominate a couple of the finest bits of Ricardian fiction? You can say the obvious ones if you like, or you can go for deeply obscure ones to entice listenership into, discovering something new. Ken, would you like to go first?
Yes, just very quickly back to Markham. I wonder how much effect he had on fiction in the 1920s and 30s, because having done all that work on the 19th century, Richard lost out heavily. Most of the fiction books in the 19th century were pro-Lancastrian, certainly anti-Richard. And yet you get by the 1930s onwards, you're getting people coming through who are much more positive. Nuance on occasions, but much more positive. So I think Markham, I can't prove this, but I think Markham may well have had an effect on fiction as well, betwixt the wars. What's the best two? Well, I think We Speak No Treason is a superb book, and The Sun in Splendour. I like a lot of 19th century, but people aren't going to read those. So I would go for Crumplin's not a bad little book either, by Mary Sturge Gretton. But I might do another article on Richard III in fiction betwixt the wars, because there are some good ones there.
You say you're Sharon Penman, The Sun is Splendour, and the other one,
Rosemary Hawley-Jarman. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think they both, because we go for what effect they've had. I think they've had a tremendous effect on people. Your
selection?
It has to be Josephine Tay's Daughter of Time, because it's still such a good read, as well as being so influential. Sharon Penman was hugely influential too. It would be nice to throw in sort of something more modern, and of course I'm completely prejudiced, and it's Annie Garthwaite's Cecily.
Yeah, brilliant choice. I think they're very good choices. Okay, now David, it's tough to ask. I mean, I know we talked about this before, and I think you avoided making any reference to fiction at all. So you prepared to offer a selection?
It's a very simple reason, Alec, in that I have never read a Ricardian fiction book. I don't read very much fiction, and I have to say I started The Sun in Splendour because a friend who was not a Ricardian at all said, "Oh, I know about Richard III. I've read The Sun in Splendour," and I started it, and I sort of it's just not really my cup of tea.
Okay, in that case, I'm going to cut in and ask you to. We've talked a lot about 6 books today, and it'd be interesting to know about another work of history that you think, if you're not going to mention any fiction, you'd put on the table.
Gosh, to be honest, I think to understand Richard, I think we have to understand his life and times, and that's something that Rosemary Horrocks does really well. It's something that Anne and Livia did in the books. I think some of those collections of essays from the Ricardian, the early years of the Ricardian, they're so rich, and they show how in the 70s and 80s, when the study of the 15th century was still very much a peripheral to medieval studies, how much good work was being done by Ricardians and within the society.
And so that's books like is that like, for example, The Lordship, Loyalty?
Yeah, and what's the earlier one, Joanna? I forget. No.
Richard III, Crown and People?
Yes.
Yeah.
Crown and People. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay. And people can find those either in Barton Library or probably on secondhand online, or
and of course all the back issues, the back issues of the Ricardian, on the Society's website, and they're such a wealth of different approaches to Ricardian studies, whether that's about Richard himself, whether that's about heraldry, whether that's about just interesting individuals or places. It's such good work.
Well, look at that. So we have a winner. Thank you very much to particularly to Joanna for suggesting it, but just in case there's any doubt, the highly scientific survey, the greatest Ricardian book of all time, according to the Ricardian Podcast, is Sir Clement Markham's Richard III, his life and character reviewed in the light of recent research as of 1906. Thank you very much. Now that is all we've got time for. I hope you've enjoyed our conversation. It is in fact a microcosm of the cover story of the March 2026 edition of the Ricardian Bulletin, the members magazine for the Richard III Society, where we've asked 20 experts, including these three, to name the top 100 Ricardian reads. So there's a deeper dive there altogether, and I urge you to look in the March edition to find out. If you aren't already a member of the Society and would like to find out more, please visit our website at richardthird.net, and that is Richard followed by 3 I's.net. There's lots more information there about membership and member benefits, and you can also join online as well. So all that remains now is for me to say a massive thank you to our wonderful panelists, Joanna Laynesmith, thank you, David Grummitt, and Kenneth Hillier. Thank you, your first time on the podcast. Thank you very much, guys. And of course, thank you to our dear listeners for listening as well. If you've enjoyed listening to the podcast, please do rate it, share it, and pass it on. Spread the word. And I think until next time, that's it from all of us. Thank you. Bye-bye.